Hi everyone, welcome to my channel Bibbidi Bobbidi Books. My name is Ellie and today I'm really excited to be filming a book tag video. So I was very kindly tagged by Theo from the channel Rekindled Reader to do the Get to Know Your Fantasy Reader book tag. So thank you so much Theo for tagging me to do this one. I'm really excited to give it a go. I highly recommend for you to go and check out Theo's channel if you're into fantasy. He has such great content. I will absolutely have all of his links and everything down below. Please head on over and show him some support. But yeah, without further ado, I'm just going to jump straight in with the first prompt. So the first prompt says, what is your fantasy origin story? Basically, what kind of books got you into fantasy? So for this prompt, I had to choose Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. So I grew up reading this series. I was the Harry Potter generation, so I had the really unique experience of being able to relate to Harry and his friends with each new book, because as Harry grew up and went further and further through school, I was doing the same thing, and it really got me into reading as well, because I am actually dyslexic, so I struggled to read growing up. I found it really difficult and really challenging, and I think if it wasn't for this series and this story, I might not love books as much as I do now. So I actually started out listening to the audiobooks for this series, really loved it, connected with the characters, and then became so invested in the story that I wanted to read the books physically, because I wanted to read them as soon as they came out, and of course the physical books normally come out before the audiobooks, so it really encouraged me to read physically. So yeah, I've got a lot of nostalgia for this series, and yeah, had to pick this one for this prompt. The next prompt is, if you could be a hero in a story, who would be the author and what trope would you insist on? So for this prompt, I had quite a hard time trying to think of an answer, because a lot of my favourite fantasy authors have actually written some pretty dark worlds. So a lot of the fantasy stories that I read have a lot of conflict going on. There's normally some kind of war that's happening and a lot of danger, which makes for a really exciting story, but I don't think I would actually want to go to some of these worlds. So I was trying to think of an author who has a more light-hearted approach to fantasy, and the one that came to mind was Terry Pratchett. So I think I would like him to write my story. So if you don't know, Terry Pratchett famously wrote the Discworld series, and his books are so fun and light-hearted. He has such a great imagination. His world is so unique and interesting, and he has great characters, and I feel like his stories are quite comforting, because yes, there's a lot of fun adventure in his stories, but you never really feel like it's going to end terribly. Like, it doesn't really have very high stakes. So yeah, I think I would feel safe being in his world. So yeah, I think I'd like Terry Pratchett to write my book. And in terms of tropes, I think I would probably insist on a magic school or a magic university, because I mean, who doesn't want to go to a magical university and learn how to do magic? That is the ultimate dream. So I would love for that to be included in the story, but I would also love the found family trope as well, because that's one of my favorite tropes in fantasy or just in books in general. I love it when you get an unlikely group of people coming together for a common cause and they end up forming a really close friendship and they have that found family feeling, and yeah, I'd love to have that included in the story as well if I can be cheeky and choose two tropes. Okay, the next prompt is, what is a fantasy book you've read this year that you want other people to read? So again, this was quite a hard prompt, because I have read so many books that I've really enjoyed and that I would like other people to read, but I think the one that I'm going to go for is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. So this is such a unique little book, and I feel like it's one of those stories that you're either going to love or hate. So for that reason, I think that everybody needs to read it and just see what they think, because it is so interesting. So this story follows our main character Piranesi, who lives in this giant magical house. So this house is literally his entire universe, and the house is huge. So it has an infinite number of rooms and halls, and the lower floors are right down in the sea, and then the higher floors are up in the clouds, so it's a really interesting place to be. And the only people that live in this world or in this house are Piranesi and one other person who is known as the Other. and we basically just follow Piranesi as he goes about his day-to-day life, because this book is presented as his journal entries, so we're literally getting his thoughts as he goes room to room. And Piranesi sees himself as a scientist, and he's dedicated his life to mapping out this big house and to documenting everything that he finds in the halls. And it's so fascinating being inside his head, and throughout the story we uncovered a little bit of a mystery, and it's just really interesting. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to give anything away, and I definitely feel like this is the kind of story where you should just jump in and not have any expectations and just see what you think, because it's so interesting. So yeah, if you haven't read this one already, give it a try and let me know your thoughts. Okay, the next prompt is, what is your favourite fantasy subgenre and what is one that you haven't read much from? So for this prompt I would have to choose high fantasy as my favourite genre, because I just love being fully submerged in a new world. I like to escape to a new place where there's different fantasy races and where there's a cool magic system, and yeah, I just want that pure escapism from my reading, so I love high fantasy. But if you want something a little bit more niche than that, I also really love fairy tale retellings, in particular dark fairy tale retellings, because I love the combination of having a whimsical fairy tale like story alongside creepy, so maybe slightly gothic horror type elements. I just love those two things together. And if you want to be even more specific than that, I particularly love retellings of Russian folklore and fairy tales. I've read quite a few Russian inspired fantasy stories and have loved them all. I just find it so fascinating. In fact, one of my favourite series of all time is actually the Winter Night series by Catherine Arden, which starts with The Bear and the Nightingale. So this story follows our main character Vasilisa, who is a young girl in the beginning of the book, and we see her growing up across the trilogy, and she is a really interesting character. She's very much connected to traditions and to nature, and she has this really cool ability to communicate with the household spirits and the spirits of the forest. And the story takes off when her dad actually remarries, because her mum died in childbirth, and so her dad goes to Moscow and brings back a new wife, and his new wife is actually a devout Christian, and she is very afraid, and she thinks that the household spirits that Vasilisa can communicate with are actually devils or demons, and that her way of life is evil. And so she brings this priest to town to try and purify the village, I guess, and to kind of cast out these demons, and the story takes off from there. It's so interesting. I love the theme of organised religion versus folklore and fairy tales. I love the villain in this story as well. I thought that he was so fascinating and had such an interesting dynamic with Vasilisa, and yeah, the world is fantastic. The writing is so gorgeous and immersive, and it's incredibly atmospheric as well, because a lot of this book takes place in the biting cold winter, so it's super atmospheric and just perfect for the winter months. So yes, I can recommend this book highly enough. Definitely check it out if you haven't already. Okay, so the next prompt is, who is one of your auto-buy fantasy authors? So I'm not really an auto-buy type of person. There aren't really any authors that I would just automatically buy a book from. I normally like to choose stories that I think I will connect with or that I'm particularly interested in. But I think the author that I'm going to choose for this prompt is Erin Morgenstern, who was the author of The Starless Sea, which is one of my favourite books, but also The Night Circus, which is also fantastic. And the reason why I'm choosing her is because her stories are so unique and her writing is so atmospheric and creative. And both The Starless Sea and The Night Circus I would recommend going into with an open mind and without knowing too much about, and just being in it for the journey, because they are so interesting in the way that they're written and the stories really go places that you don't expect. And so for that reason, if Erin Morgenstern was to come out with another book, I would probably pick it up before researching too much into it, just because I want to have that experience of her writing. And yeah, I'd just be so fascinated to see what else she comes up with, because she has such a creative mind, and yeah, her writing is just lyrical and whimsical and gorgeous as well. So yeah, Erin Morgenstern is the author that I'm going to pick for this prompt. Okay, so question number 6 is, how do you typically find fantasy recommendations? So this is an easy answer. I absolutely find all of my recommendations through booktube. I'm a big booktube fan. It's why I started this channel. I love watching booktube, and I just think it's a really great way to find recommendations, because it feels like you've got a load of friends who are recommending you stories, and that's just really lovely. And I definitely have a lot of booktubers who I feel have similar taste to my own, and I really trust their opinions, so I think that's a really fantastic way to find books that I'm pretty sure that I'm gonna love. Okay, so prompt number 7 is, what is an upcoming fantasy release that you're excited about? So I have 2 answers for this prompt. The first one is Babel by R.F. Kuang. This is a dark academia fantasy story, and I have heard nothing but positive things about this book. It's received a lot of buzz online, everybody has been hyping it up, and I'm just really intrigued to see what all the fuss is about, basically, and to see why everybody is loving it so much. I know R.F. Kuang is a much beloved fantasy author, so I've got high hopes for this one. I'm sure it's going to be fantastically written, and everyone says that it's really well researched as well. And yes, I'm very intrigued by that one. And then the other book that I wanted to mention is the second book in the Amari and the Night Brothers series by B.B. Alston. I can't actually remember what the second book is called, but I'll put a picture up on the screen for you so that you can see it. But this is such a great fantasy middle grade series. I love middle grade stories. I feel like people of all ages can appreciate middle grade. It's not just for children. And I loved the first book in this series. So in this series we follow our main character Amari, who is a young girl, and her brother actually went missing and has been presumed dead by the police. But Amari has always held out hope that her brother is still alive and out there somewhere, and she is determined to get to the bottom of it. And the story takes off when she finds this briefcase in her brother's room, and this briefcase turns out to be an invitation that was meant for her eyes only, and it is an invitation to try out for the secretive Bureau of Supernatural Affairs, I think it's called. And yeah, so Amari basically finds out that her brother was involved in this secret bureau, and she follows in his footsteps and decides to try out for a position within the bureau, and she discovers this whole fantasy world. So she realizes that all manner of fantasy creatures actually do exist, but they've just been in hiding from humanity, and it's just so fun. I highly recommend this series. Okay, so question number 8 is, what is a misconception about fantasy that you would like to lay to rest? So for this question, I feel like a lot of people think that fantasy is basically just going on an epic adventure and there being dragons and dwarfs and elves and that sort of thing. People tend to typically think of Lord of the Rings or Dungeons and Dragons or Warhammer, and yes, while those things have been hugely influential in the fantasy genre, and high fantasy often revolves around those types of things, that isn't the whole of fantasy. Like, we have a lot of sub-genres under the umbrella term of fantasy that I feel like a lot of people aren't aware of. So for example, we have fantasy romance, where it's basically a romance story that's set in a fantasy world. For example, you've got A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J Maas. You've got urban fantasy, which is set in like a real world type setting, like I'm thinking Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. You've got grimdark fantasy if you prefer something that's a little bit darker and grittier. So a classic example would be the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. You've got fairy tale retellings, I've already mentioned Catherine Arden, and you've got historical fantasy with something like The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, where they based their story on real historical events but weaved in some fantasy elements. You've also got comedic fantasy like the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett. You've got paranormal fantasy, you've got low fantasy and magical realism as well, if you don't want something that has a lot of fantasy in it and you just want a little flavour or a little twist of something fantastical in your stories. So yeah, there's a whole ton of fantasy genres, many more than I've already mentioned, and I just feel like there's something for every reader, and a lot of people don't realise that. And so yeah, I would like more people to know and more people to try different styles of fantasy and to see what works for them. So yeah, that's going to be my answer for this prompt. Okay, so the next prompt says, if someone you know that doesn't read a lot of fantasy asks for a recommendation, what are the first 3 books that come to mind? So this is a really difficult one to talk about because it depends on that person's reading tastes. You know, I already discussed that there are a whole ton of fantasy subgenres, and so I would want to choose something that's going to work for that person and to fit with their other interests. So yeah, it's hard to come up with 3 fantasy books for this prompt, but the first one that I'm going to choose is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. So this is a young adult fantasy book. It's the first in a duology, and the reason why I think this is good for new fantasy readers is because it's set in a city called Ketterdam, which isn't too dissimilar from our world, and so I feel like it's not too much to get your head around in terms of world building. And we follow a group of characters who are all part of this crime gang that live in the underbelly of the city, and they are trying to pull off this impossible heist, which is just such a fun story and a fun trope to have in a book. So I feel like a lot of people are going to really love this one. The characters are fantastic, and yes, there are of course fantasy elements in here. We have a group of people called the Grisha who have magical powers basically, but it's not a huge focus. It's more a focus on this crime group who are trying to pull off this heist, and so I think it's not that intimidating if you are new to fantasy, and so yeah, I think this could be a good place to start. Okay, and the next book that I'm going to choose is The City of Brass by S.A. Chakravorty. So this is the first book in a fantasy trilogy, and it's a whole lot of fun. I really do enjoy this series, and the first book takes place in 18th century Cairo, or at least it starts off there. So it starts off in a real world setting, so it's not too much to get your head around, and we follow our main character Nahari, who is a con artist living on the streets of Cairo, and she has this affinity for medicine, and she can kind of detect people's ailments, and she uses that very much to her advantage to swindle people on the streets of Cairo and to get by. And the story takes off when one day she decides to do this ritual that she doesn't think will actually work, and she decides to say some of the words in her native language, which is something that she doesn't normally speak, and she accidentally summons this Jinn warrior, and the 2 of them end up on the run together, and the Jinn warrior takes her to this magical city known as Davabad, and the rest of the story kind of takes place from there. So yeah, this is such a fun fantasy world to be in. The writing is really easy to fall into. The atmosphere is great. I love the desert fantasy setting, and the characters are great. There's a bit of romance in here as well to lighten things up a little bit, and the magic in here is it's not too intense. It's definitely not a hard magic system. I would say it's a very soft magic system. You just have these Jinn type characters who can do certain magic, and you just kind of accept it for what it is, and so for that reason I feel like it's not too intimidating if you're new to the fantasy genre. So yeah, I would recommend this one. And the third book that I would choose is a classic, and that is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. So The Hobbit is such a well-known and well-loved story. The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit sort of world in general has been hugely influential to the fantasy genre. J.R.R. Tolkien really sort of set the bar in terms of world building, and a lot of the things that he included in his stories are things that we still see in epic fantasy today. So if you really want to get a true flavour for fantasy and high fantasy, then I would definitely recommend checking out J.R.R. Tolkien's work and starting with The Hobbit, because it's just one book, so you don't have to commit to a big long series, and the story is a little bit more accessible than The Lord of the Rings. So in this story we follow our main character Bilbo Baggins, who is a hobbit, and he basically gets convinced to join this group of dwarves who are trying to reclaim some treasure, some of their lost treasure, which is currently being guarded by this big dragon called Smaug. So it's a very kind of traditional fantasy story, and it's a lot of fun. It's quite light-hearted as well. There's quite a lot of humour in there, and I just think it's such a fantastic place to start if you're new to fantasy, and if you really want to understand the genre, and to start with something that was really influential to the genre. And that would also be the perfect place to jump into Lord of the Rings. If you did enjoy it, then I would recommend continuing on and reading The Lord of the Rings, which is a little bit more complex and obviously lengthier than The Hobbit. Okay, and the final prompt is just to tag some other fantasy readers to give this a go. So I'm going to tag some people. I have their links down below if you want to go and check them out. If I've tagged you, I'd love to hear your answers, but please don't feel pressured to do this video if you don't want to, or if you've not got time or whatever. It's just a bit of fun. And yeah, anyway, I feel like I'm rambling now and I have a very dry mouth from talking so much, so I'm going to end the video here. I really hope that you've enjoyed it. I hope you're having a fantastic day, whatever it is you are doing. Thank you so much for watching and for supporting my channel. If you enjoyed it, please do give this video a like because it really helps me out, and subscribe if you want to see more from me. And yeah, I guess I'll see you next time with another video. Bye!